Good evening, dear listeners. You're tuned in to our channel of cozy bedtime stories, the perfect place to drift into dreams, accompanied by tales of wonder and wisdom. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss a new adventure or a soothing story to end your day. There are many more captivating journeys ahead to help you relax, unwind, and fall asleep with a smile. Tonight, I invite you on a remarkable journey back in time, into the heart of ancient England, a land threatened by Viking invasions and teetering on the edge of chaos. This is the story of a man whose name would echo through history as a symbol of wisdom, courage, and hope, King Alfred the Great. You'll hear how an unlikely prince became a legendary ruler, how exile and hardship nearly broke him, and how, against all odds, he united his people, defeated powerful enemies, and laid the foundations for the nation we now call England. So, settle in and get comfortable. Close your eyes and let this legendary tale carry you into the world of heroes and dreams, where the mightiest kingdoms are built not only by sword, but by heart and mind. And now, our story of King Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great. Part 1. The Dawn of a King. Long before England called itself by its name, when the land was still a scattered tapestry of warring kingdoms, a child was born in Wantage, Berkshire, in the winter of 849, whose destiny would reshape the future of the entire realm. That child's name was Alfred, son of Ethelwulf, King of Wessex, fifth in the line of succession, and the least likely to ever wear a crown. Yet fate, always cunning in its designs, had prepared trials, storms, and opportunities to test the steel of the man who would become known as Alfred the Great. The early years. Alfred's earliest memories were not those of palaces and battles, but of stories and song. He was doted upon by his mother, Osburh, a woman famed for her wisdom and learned ways, who saw from the beginning that her youngest son had a mind keen as the northern wind. Osburh filled the royal chambers of Wantage with the sound of Saxon poetry, readings from holy books, and legends of both saints and warriors past. One night long remembered in the chronicles, Osburh gathered her 5 sons and showed them a beautifully illuminated book of Saxon poetry. "Whosoever of you can learn these songs first," she said, her voice like the flickering light on the ornate pages, "shall have this book for his own." Alfred, though the youngest and barely able to read, listened so intently that he learned the verses by heart within days. When he recited them to his mother, he won not only the book, but also her enduring admiration. It was a moment that foretold much, for Alfred's hunger for learning would set him apart from his elder brothers Ethelstan, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred, and from almost all the warrior kings of his day. Across the sea, Rome, and the papal blessing. As Alfred neared the age of 5, his father Ethelwulf resolved to undertake a pilgrimage to Rome. The journey was a marvel, for it was rare for a Saxon king to risk the perils of sea, bandit, and plague to tread the sacred roads of empire. But the pious Ethelwulf was determined to show gratitude for his victories over the Britons and to secure blessings for his house. Alfred, chosen above his brothers, traveled alongside his father. The journey left deep impressions on the boy's mind. Vast forests, teeming with unknown creatures, bustling ports thick with the scent of salt and olive oil, cities ringed with crumbling Roman walls, all passed before his curious eyes, planting seeds of wonder. Most significantly, Alfred met Pope Leo IV, who anointed him with holy oil. Chroniclers later wrote that the Pope adopted Alfred as a spiritual son and invested him with a special blessing. The young prince, barely understanding the Latin spoken around him, felt something weighty settle upon his brow, a sense that he bore not only royal but divine favor. They returned in triumph, bearing relics, holy relics, and strange Roman customs. But what lived longest in Alfred's heart was the grandeur of learning he saw in the papal city. He became determined, even as a child, to awaken such greatness in his own land. Shadows over Wessex. Britain in those days was not, as it would one day become, a singular nation. It was a patchwork of smaller kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, constantly threatened by both internecine strife and the grim shadow cast from across the North Sea. The Vikings. At first, the Vikings were little more than a rumour, a source of horror tales whispered around Wessex's winter hearths. But as Alfred grew, so too did the threat. The summer armies came in dragon-proud ships, pillaging coastlines, burning monasteries, and slaughtering indiscriminately. Yet Alfred's childhood was still mostly sheltered from these brutalities. Instead, he was schooled in the arts of kingship. While his brothers were taught to bear sword and shield, Alfred was also schooled in the laws of the Angles and Saxons, the Latin script, and the stories of the Old Testament kingsmen who bore the mantle of both war and wisdom. King Ethelwulf's household moved from palace to palace, Winchester, Reading, and the royal villa at Chippenham, each one a centre of intrigue, diplomacy, and the constant negotiation of fealty among local lords. Alfred watched silently, learning the way men bargained for honour and land, the way priests whispered in the king's ear, the way alliances were forged and broken by cups of mead and muttered oaths. The deadly tide. Vikings at the door. Alfred was barely a teenager when disaster befell the Saxons. In 865, the great heathen army landed on the shores of East Anglia. Unlike previous raids, this was no fleeting band of marauders. These were seasoned warriors, led by the infamous sons of Ragnar Lothbrok Ubbe, Ivar the Boneless, and Halfdan intent on the full conquest of England. The news spread like wildfire. Lindisfarne, Jarrow, and other holy sites had been razed. Northumbria had fallen into chaos. The Northmen's banners, decked with ravens, inspired terror everywhere. Wessex was soon caught in the deadliest struggle it had ever known. Alfred's brothers took turns upon the throne as the storm raged. First Ethelstan, then Ethelbald, who quarrelled with their father and ruled briefly. Upon Ethelbald's death, the crown passed to Ethelbert, then at last, in 866, to Ethelred. Alfred saw his older brothers burdened one after the other with kingship, each tested by fate, each paying a mortal price for defending Wessex. Yet through all this, Alfred remained a steadfast advisor-wise beyond his years, always at his brother's right hand. Alfred, the warrior. At 20, Alfred was no longer the bookish child he had once been. The times had changed him. He had spent long months riding with his brother Ethelred's warriors, learning to read the land for ambush and to steel his heart for the screams of the dying. His first great taste of war came at the Battle of Englefield in the winter of 871, where the West Saxons struck a rare victory against the Danes in the fog-clad hills. Alfred, fighting alongside his brother, acquitted himself with distinction. Soon thereafter followed a series of desperate battles, Reading, Ashdown, Basing, Merton, as the armies clashed in bitter, icy fields. At Ashdown, it was Alfred who rallied the troops. When the battle lines faltered and his brother the king tarried at prayer, Alfred seized the initiative. He charged the Danish shield wall atop a steep ridge, igniting the bloodlust of his men. It was a savage melee, axes shattering shields and battle cries echoing across the downs. When the dust settled, the Saxons held the field, but victory proved bittersweet. The war had not been won, only survived for yet another day. The Danes, under capable leaders, learned from each defeat, and each loss carved away at the strength of the West Saxons. The shadow grows. Ethelred's death. By the early months of 871, Wessex was nearly brought to its knees. Plague stalked the land, and famine gnawed at the people. Each new battle was a gamble with extinction. Then came the gravest blow. Queen Osburh, whom Alfred had loved so dearly, had died years earlier, leaving a hollow in his heart. Now King Ethelred, after grievous wounds at Meryton, too, faded day by day. With his dying breath, Ethelred entrusted the crown to Alfred, his youngest brother. Alfred was crowned at Kingston upon Thames, but the news was overshadowed by the near despair that gripped the Saxons. The great heathen army was all but unstoppable. Other kingdoms, Northumbria, East Anglia, had already fallen. Only Wessex stood defiant. It was a heavy burden for a young man of just 22-1, who had always thought of his calling as a scholar, not a warlord. Yet as the new King Alfred walked the trembling halls of Winchester, the eyes of all Wessex turned to him with hope and expectation. "This land," he swore in the hush of night, "shall not fall while breath endures in my body." First steps, as King Alfred's first acts as king, were marked by both wisdom and desperation. He summoned his noblemen to council, seeking not only loyalty, but also to inspire them with hope. He called upon the church, upon bishops and abbots, upon their prayers and the treasure they could muster for defense. A truce was brokered with the Danes. A brief and uneasy peace bought at great cost. Tribute was paid. For a time, the Viking host withdrew to London. During this respite, Alfred set himself to rebuilding the tattered fabric of his kingdom. He reformed the Fyrd, the Saxon militia requiring all landowners owe service to king and country, dividing his army so half were always at home to care for the land, while the other half remained ready for war. Yet these were only stopgaps. Everyone in Alfred's court knew the enemy would return. The Danes, restless, greedy, and cunning, were only biding their time, waiting for Saxon watchfulness to weaken. The burden of loss. As Alfred lay awake at night, he remembered his travels to Rome, his mother's tales, his brother's dying words. His dreams of a peaceful, learned kingdom seemed impossibly remote amid the iron and fire of war. But in the depth of these darkest moments, the seeds of Alfred's greatness began to flower. He would fight not only to preserve his kingdom's freedom, but to ennoble its soul. He would make Wessex and all of England a land where laws were just, where learning was prized, and where the church and crown worked in sacred harmony. Yet all that would depend on survival, a survival that looked less and less likely as the omens of the Northmen again gathered on the storm-thrown coasts of the kingdom. Alfred the Great, Part 2, Into the Maelstrom. A kingdom besieged. The winter winds howled across the chalk hills of Wessex as King Alfred took his first perilous steps on the throne. The land itself seemed to groan under the weight of uncertainty. Fields lay fallow, farms were often abandoned, and the haunted ruins of monasteries told the story of the Viking scourge. Only a few towns-fortified burhs, surrounded by earthen walls, offered the semblance of safety. By 872, Alfred's rule had settled into an uneasy rhythm of skirmishes, negotiations, and bitterly brief peaces. The Vikings, led by sly and battle-hardened chieftains, were never far from the Saxon borders. Though a temporary armistice had been hammered out, Alfred knew it was but a fragile barrier against the renewed tide of battle. The West Saxons, too, were weary. Years of war had depleted both coffers and courage. Taxes rose, tempers frayed, and even some of the great thegns of Wessex questioned whether fighting the Norsemen was worth the cost. Yet Alfred, battered as he was by constant loss, clung to faith and determination. He felt a powerful obligation handed down from his father and his brothers to keep alive the hope of a united land. Betrayals and the breaking point. In distant Mercia and Northumbria, Viking law ruled. Danelaw, as it came to be known, replaced the old Saxon ways with foreign customs and pagan shrines. Wessex stood alone, hemmed in by enemies, yet still not entirely united within. In 875, just as Alfred's hard-won truce showed signs of holding, a treacherous storm washed over his land. Guthrum, the Viking king in East Anglia, broke the peace and moved his armies south with terrifying speed. At the same time, a Danish fleet patrolled the southern coasts, threatening Alfred with attack from both land and sea. The Saxon king's most trusted nobles were falling away. Some, doubting the cause, offered themselves and their wealth to the Danes in desperate attempts to spare their families. Others, fearing the king's failure, hoarded resources against the grim possibility of defeat. Then, in the bleak heart of winter, Alfred received word that betrayed his worst fears. The Danes had slipped past his sentinels, seizing Wareham and Exeter, seeding terror throughout the region. Townsfolk fled before the advancing Norsemen. Alfred gathered his few remaining loyal captains and prepared for the unthinkable, a desperate defense against an enemy who seemed both numberless and merciless. The flight to the marshes. It was in the dark of January 878, the lowest, bitterest moment of Alfred's life, that disaster fell. Guthrum's army swooped into Chippenham, the royal seat where Alfred had made his winter quarters. The Danes came by night, exploiting the cold and the king's weariness. The court was thrown into chaos. Some were slaughtered in their beds, others trampled trying to flee. Alfred barely escaped with his life, his few guards and closest family at his side, riding hard into the wild marshlands of Somerset. The king, who had once dreamed of law and letters, was now reduced to fugitive, fighting cold, hunger, and despair on the flooded fens of the River Parrett. The foes who once feared him now proclaimed his doom across the land. It seemed that the House of Cerdic, the ruling family of Wessex, would be snuffed out forever. Alfred's kingdom was all but lost. Even now, many noblemen hastened to swear allegiance to Guthrum, believing the Saxon star had set. The king in the wilderness. Yet it was in this darkest exile that Alfred's greatness began to reveal itself, not in proud palaces or on bloody fields, but amidst the silent reeds and haunted woods of Athelney. The story most often told from this period is the legend of Alfred and the cakes. Hungry and in disguise, the king found shelter with a humble cowherd and his wife, who, unaware of his identity, asked him to watch her cakes baking on the hearth. Distracted by thoughts of his kingdom, Alfred let them burn. When scolded by the wife, he apologized meekly, unashamed to accept honest correction even in his misery. If the tale were legend alone, it would matter little. But Alfred's humility and willingness to endure hardship without complaint, won him the steadfast loyalty of the few who shared his exile. He mapped out the network of marsh paths, moved quietly among peasants and soldiers alike, and sent word across the lands that Wessex was not yet vanquished. At Athelney, Alfred constructed a small but defensible fort, marshaled what resources he could, and gathered an unlikely army farmers, outlaws, and fugitives willing to fight for their old way of life. His band was small, but their hope burned as fiercely as the king's. The light returns. Rumors of Alfred's survival began to spread. News, relayed in whispers from market to market and echoed in the songs of travelling minstrels, told of a king unbroken by defeat. Saxon families, exhausted by Danish cruelty, held tight to the embers of hope he represented. Slowly, men began slipping from their homes and fields, gathering at Athelney or promising to muster when the king gave the call. Alfred sent trusted messengers to key nobles who'd once sworn service to his father and brothers. Some ashamed of their earlier submission or spurred by tales of Danish betrayal offered men gold and secret oaths in return for a chance at redemption. The people remembered the old prophecies, the stories of David in the wilderness. For the first time in months, prayers for victory returned to the churches. By Easter, Alfred's resolve was sharpened to the point of steel. Summoning all those still faithful, he bade them meet him by the ancient woods of Selwood, south of Bath. Here he revealed himself not as a vagabond, but as the rightful and anointed King of Wessex. From Somerset, Dorset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire, they came, men who had lost fathers, siblings, friends, and fortunes to the relentless Northmen, yet who were willing to risk everything for one last chance at freedom. The muster of Egbert's Stone. The turning point came in May 878, when Alfred and his ragged army swelled, now to a surprising size, marched to Egbert's Stone, a place of legend named for Alfred's grandfather, Egbert of Wessex. The air was thick with tension. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. Alfred, standing before his gathered thegns and calls, reminded them of all that had been lost. Our homes lie in ashes, our lordly halls plundered, our holy places defiled by pagan men. Yet while breath endures within us, we are not defeated. Let them come with their axes and their fury. We shall meet them with steel and with faith, and God will decide the victory. His words blazed like fire in the hearts of his audience. They swore their swords to him once more. The miracle of Edington. With this new force, Alfred moved with speed and caution. He knew that Guthrum, swelled with pride at having driven the king to ground, would not expect a counterstroke. Riding hard, the Saxon host marched on the Danes near Edington, a chilly plain where both fate and faith would be tested. On the morning of battle, Alfred ordered his priests to celebrate Mass and then led his men into the field, the silver cross glimmering above the banners of Wessex. The Viking shield wall, bristling with iron and snarling with hunger for victory, awaited. What happened next passed into legend. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells of a hard-fought day, with neither side giving quarter, the crash of shields and blood-spattered mud. But the Saxons, fanned into flame by Alfred's presence, prevailed. Their shield wall held, then broke the Danish line. The Norsemen, shocked by the ferocity from a king they'd thought defeated, fled in disarray toward their fortified camp. Alfred besieged the Danes there, starving them out while negotiating terms. After several tense weeks, Guthrum at last surrendered. baptism, and a new dawn. A remarkable peace followed. Guthrum, long a scourge of Wessex, agreed not only to withdraw, but to accept Christianity at Alfred's own hands. In a ceremony at Aller, with the waters of the river Parrett as witness, Alfred stood as godfather to his former enemy. The event sent ripples across England. Never before had a Viking king submitted thus to a Saxon. The Treaty of Wedmore was sealed. Guthrum and his followers swore to withdraw to East Anglia, and Alfred recognized the Danelaw's boundaries while securing his southern kingdom at last. For now, at least, England's fate was no longer in peril. The people of Wessex, grieving and battered, but unbroken, turned their eyes to Alfred, seeing him not merely as their king, but as their saviour. The king reborn. After so many years of trial, Alfred might have rested on his laurels, but the king understood that peace was as fragile as the truce that now held the Danes at bay. Wessex lay injured and half ruined. The scars of war marred both village and cathedral, and the memory of darkness lingered. Alfred began a program of renewal and reform that would make his reign legendary. He rebuilt the shattered burhs, fortifying towns across the realm with stone and ditch and timber, so that never again could an enemy sweep unopposed through his land. He reorganized the Fyrd, ensuring that the old fallback of summoning every able-bodied man gave way to a standing militia, trained and always ready to defend the shires. His laws, Dooms of Alfred, combined ancient customs with mercy, adapting the wisdom of previous kings and the scriptures for his own realm. Alfred insisted that justice be swift and fair, seeking not only to punish, but to restore and to teach. And woven into everything was Alfred's deep devotion to learning and the church, the golden thread that bound his youth in wantage to the battlefields of Wessex, knowing that the monks and priests who preserved the word of God and the wisdom of ages had died in droves during the Danish terror. Alfred summoned scholars from across the seas. He established schools and ordered the translation of Latin books into the vernacular so that all, even those who knew no tongue but their own might, share in the light of knowledge. Alfred, once the child who listened at Osburh's knee, was now himself the father of a people, a king who ruled not only with the sword, but with the pen and book and prayer. The aftermath and new threats. But victory at Edington and the Peace of Wedmore were not the end of Alfred's trials. New Viking armies would come. The balance of power would shift with every passing year, and even within his own court, jealousy and bitterness always threatened to erupt. For now, though, there was hope, a fragile, flickering hope pressed into the hearts of the weary Saxons by the hand of a king who would one day be called Great. Alfred the Great, Part 3, The Architect of a Kingdom. Beyond survival, the spring after the miracle at Edington brought a transformation not just for Alfred, but for all Wessex. Scarred by years of war, the land itself seemed to sigh with relief. Villages rose from ashes, fields were tilled once more, and churches burned or desecrated echoed once again with prayer. But victory in battle had birthed new burdens. The Saxons had survived, yet the spectre of the Northmen still loomed beyond the Danelaw boundary. The peace with Guthrum and the Danish settlers was tenuous, watched over with vigilance and wary hope. Alfred now set his mind to a task even greater than war, forging what was still only a loose collection of shires into a kingdom that could endure storms yet to come. Rebuilding walls and spirits. The first phase of Alfred's ambition was defense, He was haunted by how easily the Danes had overrun and plundered his people. Now, with startling energy, he began the massive project of fortifying the heartland of Wessex. Towns and cities were chosen for strategic burhs-fortified settlements, circled by new ramparts of earth, wood, and sometimes stone. Alfred's engineers designed them on precise grids so that defences could be manned rapidly in a crisis. Rural folk were organised to contribute labour and provisions for the defence of these new strongholds. Winchester, the old royal capital, became both Alfred's seat and a symbol of rebirth. By the end of his reign, some 30 burhs girded Wessex, each linked by roads and a rudimentary system of messengers. Never again, he decreed, would a Saxon king be caught unprepared in his own palace. To keep this new defensive system effective, Alfred realized he needed a reliable and swiftly mobilized fighting force. The third, the classic Anglo-Saxon militia, was reorganized into two halves, so that at any time, one half of the men farmed, while the other served at arms. In this way, the land was not neglected, the crops would not wither, and in times of crisis, Alfred could always field an army. He also turned his keen attention to the rivers and the sea. With the lessons of the past fresh in mind, Alfred became the father of the English Navy, overseeing the construction of longboats, ships longer than those of the Vikings, with higher sides and increased striking power. The coasts were patrolled and harbours built to shelter the royal fleet. Though still small and inexperienced, the Wessex Navy would become a cornerstone of defence for years to come. The light of learning, Alfred did not believe that strength lay in arms alone. All through his exile and the hardships of war, he had mourned the decline of learning and the scattering of the men who preserved wisdom. The burning of monasteries by the Norsemen had been more than an attack on property. It was an assault on the soul of the Saxon people. He gathered what scholars he could find, some from Mercia, more from the continent of Europe, and installed them at his court. Notable among these were Grimbald from Francia, John the Old Saxon from Germany, and Plegmund, a brilliant Mercian who would become Archbishop of Canterbury. Alfred also established schools for the sons of the nobility and promising young freemen, decreeing that none should become a priest without mastery of both Latin and the English tongue. More radically, Alfred set about translating sacred and secular texts into Anglo-Saxon, so that his people could learn not only scripture, but the wisdom of law, philosophy, and history. Among the great works he had translated or adapted were Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, Bede's Ecclesiastical History, and parts of Augustine's Soliloquies. He himself, it is said, laboured nightly with his clerks, correcting passages, noting difficult words, ensuring the spirit of the texts survived in translation. He wrote in the prefaces of these books, words as alive today as in his day. What I set out to do was to suggest, by God's help, that wisdom, which had been so completely buried in England, might again be sought after. In Alfred's mind, learning and godliness were the twin pillars on which just rule must stand. The king as lawgiver. Yet if Alfred dreamed of an educated realm, he was equally determined to make it a lawful one. The land was exhausted by disorder, not just from war, but from years of piecemeal local justice. The weak and even the strong suffered when law was absent or corrupt. He summoned assemblies of nobles, priests, and wise men to compose a new code, drawing together the old customs of Kent, Mercia, and Wessex, leavened with biblical justice and his own sense of mercy. The Doom Book, or Laws of Alfred, made justice central to kingship. Murder, theft, oath-breaking, and abuse of the weak were all given clear punishments, but always with the chance for compensation and repentance. This code was not merely about punishment. Alfred's laws preserved community and discouraged vengeance. He instituted regular courts and expected his noblemen to judge with both fairness and firmness, and he inspected their doings with his own travelling circuit of officials. In Alfred's idea of rule, the king was answerable before God for the care of the souls as well as the lives of his people. The just king, more even than the victorious king, would, he hoped, win the blessing and protection of heaven. Family ties and diplomatic bonds. Even as he tamed his turbulent realm, Alfred kept a careful eye on the wider world. He knew that Wessex could not forever face the storms alone. Through marriage and diplomacy, he began to weave a network of alliances that reached well into the future. His daughter, Ethelflaed, wise and decisive, was betrothed to Ethelred of Mercia, an alliance that, over time, would help unify those two once divided kingdoms. Alfred's eldest son, Edward, was trained as a warrior and statesman, destined to inherit both his father's strength and his vision. Peace was kept with Guthrum's successors in East Anglia, though trust was always a luxury. With the Welsh princes to the west and the Celts beyond, he bargained and bartered, sometimes with gifts, sometimes with veiled threats, but always with the goal of peace on his southern and western borders. He corresponded too with rulers from the continent, from Charlemagne's heirs in Francia, whose example in combining faith and kingship Alfred often tried to emulate. Shadows and challenges. Yet all Alfred's reforms and hopes were threatened, again and again, by the resurgence of Norse power. The years after Eddington brought periodic raids as new Viking armies landed on the coast or swept in from Ireland and Francia, seeking plunder or fresh conquest. In 886, the city of London fell to Norsemen from East Anglia. With patience and cunning, Alfred eventually recaptured London, repairing its Roman walls and restoring its market and defences, making it a thriving commercial hub under Saxon law, a glittering prize for his realm and a monument to his strategy. Still, every year brought new dangers. In those dark ages, the shadow of the dragon-prowed ships was never far from English shores, and the king grew all too familiar with anxiety, late-night councils, and prayers for deliverance. Alfred himself was often sick, his body racked by mysterious pains that some ascribed to poison, others to a lifelong illness. His letters and laws make clear the toll these years took on him. "I have been beset by much sickness," he wrote painfully, "and by troubles in mind and in body, burdens internal and external." But these same troubles, he believed, had been placed upon him as a kind of trial tests of virtue and perseverance in service of God and England. Alfred's legacy in the making. Alfred's struggles, reforms, and visions bore fruit before his very eyes. By the late 880s and early 890s, the once shattered kingdom was transformed. Where there had once been scattered shires and villages, now stood a nation with fortified towns, regular courts, standing armies, and schools where Latin, grammar, and law were taught to the next generation. His efforts to record and preserve England's story helped shape not only his own legend, but the very idea of Englishness. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun in his court, became the most important record of his times and those that followed. Alfred, while never officially crowned King of England, united the southern territories so fully that his son and grandsons would extend this unity to the whole island. Alfred had provided the blueprint for England's growth, a vision founded on resilience, wisdom, and a determination to see justice and faith prevail over might and despair. A king among the people. In his later years, Alfred became something more than just a king. The peasantry around Winchester and the burghs called him Father, for he was often seen moving among them, listening to their cases in person, or teaching a boy letters at the church schools he so prized. He was beloved and at times feared. His eyes, pale blue and piercing, seemed able to detect treachery or cowardice, yet stories abound of his kindness, the gift of a cloak to a beggar, the soft word to a trembling tenant, the tireless support for religious houses rebuilding after years of war. He never ceased to read, to question, and above all, to pray. Alfred believed sincerely that he was an instrument of God's providence, chosen not only for his own sake, but for that of the land and people entrusted to him. The gathering clouds. But even in times of peace, the king knew the fragile nature of his achievements. Wessex still recovered from wounds both old and new. Famine followed poor harvests, and the spectre of plague remained, a danger never far from a medieval kingdom. And always, there were the Danes. The fleet still came, and every few years brought new wars, new threats on the coasts, and the challenge to the hard-won peace Alfred had crafted with such hardship. As he entered the final years of his reign, Alfred prepared his family and advisors for a world in which new storms would threaten England, hoping always that the house he had built would endure the centuries to come. In Alfred the Great, England had found not just a war leader, but the father of the nation, one who had survived exile and defeat, seized victory from ruin, and set in motion the forces that would make England strong, law-abiding, and wise. Alfred the Great, Part 4, The Final Vigil. Withstanding the rising storm, the sun never seemed to shine long over the kingdom Alfred had forged. No sooner did the burghs flourish and trade return to the markets, the new omens of disaster swept in from the grey horizon. The seas had not grown less mysterious, nor the ambitions of foreigners less fiery. By the late 880s, the waves brought fleets of Norsemen from Normandy and Flanders. These new Danes were hungry, landless men, driven by the growing population in conquered territories and by rumours of Wessex's new wealth. As raids multiplied, Alfred's reforms were put to their ultimate test. The call to arms rang out from every fortified burgh. The newly disciplined Fyrd, drilled to respond in rotation, meaningfully blunted many of the surprise attacks that had once laid the land waste. The navy, though still novice, intercepted enemy ships at river mouths and coastal inlets. The Queen, Ealhswith, a wise and steady consort, coordinated relief and watched over the royal children, now deeply involved in learning the Saxon arts of war and government. Alfred, no longer the fugitive of Athelney, but now the undisputed master of his lands, acted with tireless resolve. Yet he was never at ease. His body ached with old pains, and the toil of kingship wore at him deeply. But he would be seen at dawn or dusk riding along ramparts, conferring with his captains, bringing new hope wherever he went. The Siege of Rochester and the Battle of Kent. The most daring of the late Viking campaigns came in 892. Armed with new alliances and larger warbands, a vast Danish fleet landed in the Thames estuary. capturing the fortress at Appledore in Kent and threatening to overrun southern England yet again. When news reached Alfred, he marshalled his armies with a swiftness only years of practice could have produced. Mercian allies responded under Ethelred's command, and Alfred's son Edward, proving himself a formidable heir, joined his father in the field. At Rochester, the Danes laid siege to the Burh, but its fortifications designed in Alfred's image held firm. The attackers, frustrated and running short on food and drink, found themselves harassed constantly by Saxon sorties. Alfred's relief army fell upon their camp, driving the invaders to their ships in panicked flight. It was a victory not just of arms, but of vision and preparation. Battle after battle, in Kent, in Essex, and along the Thames, the English met the Northmen's fury and endured. Many an old Saxon credited not just warriors, but the king's wisdom, his system of burhs, his fast mustering fyrd, and a people who, knowing what was at stake, now fought for more than survival. They fought for England. Faith at the forefront. No matter the pressing tide of war or the weariness of his body, Alfred never neglected the spiritual heart of his kingdom. He prayed at dawn, at noon, and by night. He adorned Winchester with gifts to the church and built or restored churches and monasteries across the land, especially those once destroyed by the Norse. He kept in close counsel with Archbishop Plegmund and other scholars, sponsoring the translation of new texts. When sickness allowed, he still took part in the teaching of children and clergy alike. Even foreign traders and ambassadors, Jews from the East and Christians from far Francia, arrived at his court, bearing gifts and marveling at a king whose word was law, but whose hand was open. Alfred, aware that the Spirit often sustained more than the sword, poured as much of himself into this work as he had into his castle walls and armies. A vision of law and order. Alfred's courts too grew more respected and fair. Men and women, peasants and nobles, came from Wessex and beyond to petition his judgment. He was known for swift but merciful verdicts and the insistence that even the greatest could not escape the law. Forgiveness, when earned, was a habit practiced as much as punishment. He urged future generations to desire above all else wisdom, believing in the power of Christian love and common sense to temper judgment. Many in Wessex began, for the first time in memory, to trust not in vengeance, but in justice and mercy. Preparing the future, Alfred knew how fragile peace could be. He summoned family and counsellors, planning for the day when England would face threats without him. Edward, his eldest son, was tutored not just in swordplay, but in the art of governance. His daughter Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, proved herself a skilled leader and diplomat alongside her husband. Others among his children were placed in church and royal posts, each trained to uphold his vision. Before his final years, Alfred saw the fruits of these labours, his children and grandchildren playing across the green lawns of the palace, Saxon and Mercian banners raised over once broken lands. Above all, relations between the once bitter kingdoms grew warmer. The dream that his grandfather Egbert had planted, that one day there might be one people called English, now seemed within reach. The final day's age and illness finally began to master Alfred. I have suffered very greatly in mind and body from the time I came to the kingdom until today, he wrote near the end, as I have never suffered before in my life. He confided in his scribes about the many miseries, illnesses, and anxieties that beset him. But despite the pain, he rarely allowed it to keep him from court or council. On the crisp autumn morning of 26th October 899, Alfred the Great's long struggle ended. He died quietly, surrounded by his loving family and his closest counselors, comforted by prayers and the knowledge that, though unfinished, his work would endure. The bells rang in Winchester, the heart of Wessex, and throughout the towns and burghs built by his command. Norsemen, churchmen, peasants, and kings alike paused to honor the passing of the man whose courage, patience, and wisdom had changed the fate of realms. They buried him with great solemnity at the Old Minster in Winchester, and his sons and daughters continued the battles for unity and justice he had begun. The measure of greatness. Alfred left no golden palaces, no mountains of coin, and no empire stretching overseas. His treasure was something greater, a people united by faith, law, and the hope of lasting peace. A nation of burghs and schools, of fair judges and hard-working farmers, a memory of a time when a man, defeated and pursued, had risen to make a country whole. Chroniclers, both Saxon and foreign, praised him as the greatest king who had ever ruled the English. In centuries to come, his name would echo in the halls of Parliament, in the chapels of Oxford, and in every tale told to children on winter nights, a beacon for the centuries, shining through wars, plagues, and the storms of men. No king was ever perfect, but Alfred, more than most, lived close to both his people and his God. He taught by example that greatness is forged not only in battle, but in mercy, wisdom, and the patient shaping of a world where even the least might be heard and shielded. England was rising imperfect, fragmented, yet full of promise. Thanks to Alfred, son of Ethelwulf, a kingdom would one day become a nation. And so, through dark and light, exile and triumph, ended the life of Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great, Part 5, The Hearth of the Nation. The royal Hearth family and court. Life for all his cares, Alfred the Great treasured the warmth of family. His marriage to Ealhswith, a noblewoman of mercy and blood, was not just a political alliance, but, as chroniclers say, a partnership of true affection and shared values. Ealhswith's devotion and intelligence played a quiet but vital role in matters of diplomacy and faith within the court, and she often undertook charitable and religious duties that deepened Alfred's reforms. Their family grew amidst the shifting backdrop of raid and renewal. Edward, the eldest son, was every inch a warrior prince, schooled early on in both swordsmanship and statesmanship. Ethelfled, their eldest daughter, known to history as the Lady of the Mercians, would become a legend of strength and leadership in her own right. Daughter Ethelfled, future abbess, and sons Elthryth and Ethelweard, who would bear the seeds of Alfred's lineage into both religious and secular realms. Each was beloved in the royal household. Life in Alfred's court was a blend of austerity and celebration. Mealtimes were occasions for discussion on law, scripture, poetry, and the ancient stories of the English and their neighbours. Alfred himself was both a keen listener and an active participant, often challenging his children and young nobles with riddles and questions, encouraging reason and wit. Musicians and storytellers were welcomed, their tales weaving together the histories of Saxons and Danes alike, so that old enmities might be softened by song and laughter. Hospitality for strangers, both high and low, from distant kingdoms or neighbouring shires, remained a fixed principle. Alfred's palace in Winchester hummed with the languages of merchants, the ink-stained fingers of scholars, and the solemn prayers of priests. The schools of Wessex. An educational revolution. If Alfred rebuilt the kingdom's walls from stone and earth, he rebuilt its mind through schools. He was appalled by the decline of learning after years of war. So few were the men south of the Thames who could translate a letter from Latin into English that I do not recall a single one, he mourned. Determined to change this, he made it his duty as king to train clergy and lay youth alike. He invited foreign teachers from across the Channel. Plegmund, future Archbishop of Canterbury, from Mercia, Asser from Wales, whose biography of Alfred would preserve so much of what we know, Grimbald from St. Bertin in Francia, John the Old Saxon from Aachen. These men brought not only learning, but the vibrancy of other Christian cultures to the royal court. Alfred's program was ambitious. Boys capable of learning received a basic education in reading and writing English, as well as Latin for the talented. Monasteries and churches were refounded wherever possible. Some devoted almost as much to teaching as to prayer. For the first time since the Romans left, the English began to create their own books in their own language. Bard, Gregory, and even royal laws translated so that all free-born youth of England may become men of understanding. The Crown itself sponsored new texts. Alfred's own hand added prefaces, explanations, and prayers, setting an example of kingly humility and piety. In one letter, he wrote movingly that it was at my mind's most unquiet that I resolved I would turn to wisdom. He was not above consulting his children and wife about the meanings of psalms or the meditations of Boethius, or asking a scribe to repeat an unfamiliar phrase. Learning spread outward from the court. Sons of Thanes returned home with new knowledge. Abbots taught peasant children how to read, and women as well as men were encouraged to take up the Psalter and Gospels. While the change was slow, the seeds of English literacy rooted in Alfred's reforms would shape the culture of England for 1,000 years. Law, order, and community. Alfred's new Doom Book was not a static code, but a living project. He sought always to balance the old customs, the Mosaic law as received in the Christian Bible, and the demands of justice for a growing society. His laws prescribed penalties, but emphasized, whenever possible, restitution and forgiveness over blind retribution. If men could not pay their fines, they might work in service or dedicate land to their victim or the church. Witnesses, not just accusers, were drawn into the process, and community leaders bore fresh responsibility to guarantee the honesty of their district. An accused man of good repute might be acquitted on oath. A known thief would be judged more harshly. False accusation or perjury was itself a serious crime. The king's reeves were empowered to oversee markets and town courts, reducing the opportunities for corruption or the rule of the strong by mere might. The aim, as the king made clear, was fellowship among Englishmen, especially in this land where new neighbours, Danes and Saxons, Britons and settlers from all the world, now mingled and farmed together. Alfred's practice of mercy and order ensured that exiles from the Danelaw, as well as Northmen wishing to join the peace, were given a fair hearing and land if sworn to loyalty. When disputes did erupt over borders or inheritance or slander, they were often settled locally. But Alfred himself presided over major cases, striving to be both stern and compassionate. The most famous judgment preserved from his later days concerns a murder between neighbouring lords, resolved with a fine, a public act of forgiveness. and prayers for the dead, thus halting a blood feud that might otherwise have torn two shires apart. The early legends. Alfred. Remembered. Even before his death, stories clustered around Alfred. Minstrels sang of his flight into the marshes and the burning of the cakes, of how he disguised himself as a minstrel to spy on Guthrum's camp, how he would walk alone in the court gardens reciting poetry, and how he wept when he heard the suffering of ploughmen in the winter. Chroniclers copied these tales, Asa the Welsh monk most notably, so that Alfred's reign slipped into legend even as his children still lived. Healing miracles were attributed to him. Pilgrimages were made to Winchester and to Athelney, where he had built both a fortress and a small abbey to give thanks for his deliverance. The wisdom of his laws was cited in disputes, and his translations of Bede and Gregory were read aloud on feast days and in schools. His children lived up to his hopes in many ways. Edward, as king, expanded Alfred's system of burghs and completed the unification of southern England. Ethelflaed, ruling Mercia as Lady of the Mercians, was famed as a fierce commander and a builder of new towns. Stories tell how Ethelflaed defended Chester from Norse attack and fostered alliances with Welsh princes. Together, Alfred's offspring made possible the England that would soon emerge, the land his dreams had barely glimpsed. Tachwana. Diplomacy and the wider world. Alfred was respected as far away as Rome and Constantinople. Ambassadors arrived at Winchester who spoke of the Emperor Charles the Bald, the Pope, or even, on rare occasion, emissaries from the court of Jerusalem or Spain. There are hints recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that Alfred exchanged letters with Elias III of Jerusalem, and that a small group of Christian pilgrims from India and Armenia visited his court. Among his most prized treasures were gifts from distant rulers, fine cloth from Egypt, spices and tapestries from the Levant, crosses crafted of gold and silver, and, more precious still, illuminated gospels and philosophical works. Alfred believed that the unity of Christendom must be both a shield against the pagan threat and an inspiration to English piety and learning. His treaties with the Welsh princes, with the Scots in the north, and with the kings of Francia helped to secure his borders and ensure the flow of learning and trade. He discouraged the enslavement of Christians by Christians and commanded his reeves and bishops to provide for the poor and the traveller. For we have been strangers ourselves and wanderers in a hostile world, as the scriptures said. Reflections. Before the end. In the quiet of his last autumn, Alfred took comfort in the companionship of Ealhswith, in the respectful love of his children, and in the prayers of learned friends. His greatest sorrow remained the many good men and women lost to war, plague and famine, and the unfinished work of bringing peace and justice to every corner of England. Alfred's deep humility is seen in his will, which survives to us. Modest in gifts, he left much to Ealhswith and his children, more still to the restoration of churches and the poor. He asked no grand tomb, only that he be remembered in prayer, that God may forgive my sins and have mercy on the people I have served. He did not see himself as a legend, but as a flawed servant, striving to be a wise ruler in a world whose storms and changes he could sometimes only endure, not command. Alfred the Great, Part 6. A crown passed on. The shadow of the great king. Alfred the Great's passing was felt beyond the palace walls of Winchester. For years after his burial at the Old Minster, his subjects still spoke his name in moments of dread and hope alike. When famine threatened a village, or thieves harried a market road, the old and the wise would say, "If King Alfred were here, we would find justice." At fireside and marketplace, news of foreign threat or blazing comet was met with the invocation of his memory protector, lawgiver, scholar, and shepherd of the realm. But the shield of a strong king could not prevent new dangers from gathering as the 10th century dawned. Storms beat upon the southern coasts. The Norse still ruled vast lands across the North Sea, and in their Danelaw strongholds, Welsh princes and Scottish warbands, while often peaceful, watched the south with wary eyes. The fragile unity brought by Alfred's victories seemed a thing that could yet dissolve into chaos. Yet Alfred had done something his predecessors had never achieved. He had prepared his house and his council for the long work of nationhood. Though Edward, Ethelflad, and their siblings trembled at their father's grave, they also drew strength from the legacy he had left: a system of defense, governance, rare learning, and above all, a vision of peace built through courage and forgiveness. Edward the Elder, the heir, unites a realm. Edward, Alfred's eldest son, had watched his father's reign from boyhood to battered manhood. Unlike his father, Edward was raised not just in the shadow of war, but in a royal household marked by intellectual vigor and family loyalty. The early years of Edward's reign were a trial by fire. Though well prepared, his right to rule was disputed by his cousin Ethelwald, son of Alfred's brother. Ethelwald, supported by Danes in the Danelaw and several Mercian nobles, attempted to seize Wessex with a combination of intrigue and direct assault. These first conflicts, bitterly fought, proved the strength of Alfred's legacy. Edward's armies rallied from burhs and shires, riding out on roads built at Alfred's bidding, held the line at the Battle of the Home. Ethelwald fell, and the rebellion scattered. By demonstrating that Alfred's reforms had made resistance possible and effective at every level, Edward's Wessex preserved hard-won unity. Edward then pressed north and west, fortifying the Danelaw frontier and winning a series of hard, grinding campaigns with the help of his sister, Ethelflaed, the Lady of the Mercians. If Edward ruled with his father's sword, Ethelflaed ruled with his mind, and increasingly with her own. Married to Ethelred of Mercia, she became more than a queen consort. After her husband's health failed, she ruled Mercia outright as Lady of the Mercians. Ethelflaed earned the love and admiration of her subjects as a builder and defender. She continued Alfred's policy of founding and improving burhs, including famous centres like Tamworth, Stafford, Warwick, and Chester, making them bulwarks against the Danes and centres of law and trade. Perhaps most famously, Ethelflaed led Mercian armies into battle herself, putting down Viking raids on the Welsh frontier, encouraging alliances with the Welsh princes, and coordinating strategy with her brother. She was revered by friend and feared by foe. Even the Norse poets, who hated all that was Saxon, wrote grudgingly of her as the lady who drove us from Chester. On her death in 918, Mercia recognized the authority of her brother Edward, uniting the South and Midlands of England as never before. Her daughter, Elfwin, inherited her mother's post, but soon after, Edward assumed full rule, thus fulfilling Alfred's vision of an England both wise and strong. The spreading legacy. Alfred's impact did not end with his children's achievements. The diffusion of law and learning picked up pace under Edward's reign and the rules of his sons and grandsons. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle begun in Alfred's court, continued to record the history of England for 2 more centuries, shaping the language and ideas of the people. Churchmen from South and Midland Shires promoted the Alfredian ideal that all freeborn English people, men and women, should seek understanding. Alfred's translations stayed popular, copied over the generations, so that even those who did not know Latin could hear of ancient Rome, God's law, and the glories and follies of kings. Alfred's codes of justice shaped the common law long before that term existed. His balance of local customs with royal oversight became a model for later kings. The very process of consulting nobles and wise men evolved into the system of councils and, eventually, the earliest seeds of Parliament. The long fight against the North. Despite the unity and reform Alfred bequeathed, the old enemy did not sleep. Throughout the 10th century, new waves of Norsemen from Norway and Denmark arrived sometimes to raid, sometimes to conquer, sometimes even to rule. The Danelaw, while increasingly settled and Christianized, remained a land where Danish law and Saxon customs coexisted uncomfortably. But Alfred's settlements, the burhs, the roads, the navy, meant that never again would southern and central England fall as quickly as they had in the 9th century. Each conqueror had to contend with fortified towns and trained militias ready to resist. Under Ethelstan, Alfred's grandson, the English kings would win the dramatic Battle of Brunanburh, forcing back the combined forces of Norse, Scots, and Welsh. One kingdom at last was proclaimed, England. Alfred's reforms had delayed, then made possible that moment. Even foreign chroniclers would grudgingly admit that the land found peace and law at last among Alfred's folk. Alfred's children, seeds of a dynasty. Further down the line, Alfred's descendants, through both Edward and Ethelflaed, would rule the land for over a century. The kings of the later House of Wessex, and even the rival claimants from Scandinavia, claimed Alfred's blood as a sacred right. Edward the Elder sired many children by 3 wives. His son, Ethelstan, became perhaps the first king of all England, extending Alfred's reforms, fighting the Norse, and supporting learning and monasteries. Another son, Edmund, and later generations, like Edgar the Peaceful and Edward the Confessor, would become icons of English kingship, each carrying the burden and hope of their ancestor. Among Alfred's granddaughters, some married into continental royalty, spreading his line to the courts of Francia, Germany, and even further. In legend and genealogies, half the Christian princes of Northern Europe would soon claim descent from Alfred the Wise, King of the English. Ethelflaed's role as a female ruler, rare and remarkable in her era, became a model for later English queens. Her defense and administration of Mercia offered proof that Alfred's legacy was not limited to warriors, but included all who sought to build and protect a just realm. The king as icon. In later medieval centuries, Alfred's memory only grew. As Norman and Angevin kings tried to legitimize their own claims, they linked themselves to the English Solomon. Chroniclers called him not just great, but Rex Doctissimus, the most learned of kings. His name appeared on coins, on foundation charters, and eventually in the windows of cathedrals and the pages of monastic histories. Pilgrims visited his supposed relics at Winchester. During the Renaissance, scholars like Polydore Virgil and Matthew Parker rediscovered his translations and hailed him as the father not only of English learning, but of English liberty and law. In the troubled 17th and 18th centuries, When kings and parliaments battled for power, reformers cited Alfred as the original constitutional monarch, wise, pious, limited, and just. Victorian England, eager for national icons, put up statues and named schools, ships, and societies after the great king. A people's memory. But the truest legacy of Alfred rests not just with the high and powerful, but with his people. In the West Country, tales of Alfred remain part of folk memory. How he walked in disguise among his folk, listened to the prayers of beggars, how he gave just judgment and never forgot the sufferings of exile. The stories, true and legendary, continue to bind Englishmen and women to their history. In the songs of harvesters, the proverbs of old people, and the poetry of writers from Chaucer to Tennyson, King Alfred stands at the crossroads, war leader, lawgiver, patron of peace, the mild and mighty ruler who loved wisdom above gold and mercy above vengeance. The dream endures. England's story did not end with Alfred, but it was profoundly changed by him. Even in the darkest hours when foreign armies returned in later centuries, or when kings betrayed their people, Alfred's vision endured. The hope that mercy could guide law, that learning could outlast war, and that a king could rule for the good of all, shaped the destiny of a nation. And so, in the echo of church bells and in the well-worn pages of ancient chronicles, the story of Alfred the Great remains, a beacon for those who would build, defend, and renew the land they love. Alfred the Great, Part 7, The Echoes of a King. Christian England. The spread of faith and culture. One of Alfred's deepest ambitions was the renewal of Christian life in his realm. The wars and devastations of the long Viking Age had not only shattered towns and monasteries, but driven priests and monks into hiding or exile. At his accession, many churches stood empty. Ancient abbeys like Glastonbury and Shaftesbury were roofless and overgrown. The light of learning, as Alfred called it, flickered on the edge of extinction. Alfred led a revival not merely of worship, but of sacred community. He brought monks and clergy from across Britain and even Francia. Ealhswith, his queen, was especially active in founding and endowing religious houses for women, notably the great Abbey of Shaftesbury. Alfred's daughter, Ethelgifu, became the first abbess there, presiding over a new flowering of prayer and scholarship. The king's close work with learned clerics, Plegmund, later the Archbishop of Canterbury, Asser, his Welsh biographer and teacher, John the Old Saxon helped re-establish the monasteries as centres of both faith and learning. These schools not only copied and preserved sacred texts, but, for the first time in centuries, taught the laity noblemen, minor thegns, even gifted peasants, how to read and interpret the Gospels and the law. Alfred's translations and his drive to educate in the English tongue allowed the teachings of Christ and the wisdom of Gregory, Bede, and Boethius to spread among people previously shut out by language. Churches rebuilt and schools reopened led to a new generation of priests and monks, literate in both Latin and English, ready to be both shepherds of souls and keepers of order. In time, Alfred's work would ensure Christianity would be not just the domain of kings and scholars, but the faith of a whole people, a foundation for the very idea of being English. Language and identity. It was not by chance that Alfred's court became a crucible for the English language. In his prefaces, Alfred laments that there were very few men south of the Thames who understood the rituals in English, or who could convert a letter from Latin into English. determined that his people should be united, not just by law, but by tongue. Alfred sponsored the translation of key works into Old English: Gregory's Pastoral Care, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, the Psalms, parts of Augustine, and the Dialogues. Perhaps most striking was his command that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle be kept a written annal of each year's events in English, distributed to monasteries and royal courts. For 2 centuries and more, Englishmen could read their own history in their own words. This movement fostered a sense of unity greater than the sword alone could offer. Where Norse and Frankish conquerors came and went, Alfred's English became the speech of law, sermon, and inheritance. As new families took root in the Landanes, Britons, Franks, Celts, they were drawn into the world of English letters and custom. The idea of angel sin, the English kindred, began to take root. For the first time, both poetry and law spoke of being English, not merely Saxon, Mercian, or West Saxon, but a broader identity that bound past, present, and future. The growth of burghal life. Perhaps the most visible legacy of Alfred's reign was the network of burhs fortified market towns and strongholds throughout the South and Midlands. The burhs acted as shields against foreign attack, but became much more than mere garrisons. As peace returned, the towns became vibrant economic and social centres. Markets flourished under the protection of Alfred's law. Coinage bearing his image, Latinized as Alfred Rex, became trusted throughout Britain and even traded on the continent. Artisans moved to towns to work in metal, cloth, leather, and wood. Masons and carpenters rebuilt churches, halls, and bridges. The growth of burhs encouraged the mixing of peoples. Danes who accepted Alfred's peace settled alongside Saxons, learning the king's laws, swearing oaths in his courts, and adopting Christianity. This mingling would, over centuries, merge the feuding tribes of Alfred's youth into a single nation. The burhs also became places of law and wit centres where scribes and storytellers, minstrels and preachers alike shared ideas. Songs and proverbs spread from Winchester to London, from Exeter to Gloucester, binding the culture as the king had dreamed. Alfred in song and story. If the practical achievements of Alfred's reign formed the bedrock of the English nation, it was the stories woven and retold that captured the hearts of his descendants. Asser's Life of King Alfred provided not only a detailed portrait of the king, but the earliest English biography of any ruler, drawing on both memory and legend. Minstrels and monks embroidered the story, the burned cakes in the marshes, Alfred's wandering in disguise among the Danes, his pious vigil at Athelney, his miracles and acts of mercy. These tales, blending fact and fable, fixed Alfred's image in the imagination as the hero king. He was invoked as a saint, though never canonized formally, and in some local traditions, the sick were brought to his tomb for healing. Victorious leaders were compared to him. Incompetent ones were judged by his example. Even the most arrogant kings who followed could not be greater than Alfred, only lesser. The stories changed over the centuries, taking on new colors with each age. The king was by turns a rustic hero, a wise philosopher, a lawgiver, and a hidden figure who would one day return to save England in her darkest hour. Trials of memory, the Norman conquest and after. The coming of the Normans in 1066 threatened to erase the old order. William the Conqueror and his heirs swept aside many Saxon customs and families. French became the language of law and power. The ancient monasteries were rebuilt in the Norman style. Yet Alfred's name endured. Even Norman chroniclers like William of Malmesbury found much to admire in Alfredus Magnus. Monks and minstrels copied his laws, told his stories, and celebrated his piety. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle was continued after the conquest, and references to Alfred's wisdom were often used to claim the justice of the old ways. In medieval legend, Alfred became a figure of prophecy. Some claimed his ghost walked the corridors of Winchester in troubled times, or aided the poor from beyond the grave. Others said that he appeared in dreams to guide younger rulers, or to warn them against injustice. In the legal profession, Alfred became a symbol of English liberty and due process. Magna Carta, the foundation of constitutional law, echoed themes of justice found in Alfred's dooms. English common law, shaped in courts great and small, often appealed to his example. The Renaissance and National Awakening. The rise of English as a literary language in the late medieval period and Renaissance saw a renewed interest in Alfred's works. The chroniclers of the Tudor and Stuart age seeking ancient roots for their modern nation, discovered in Alfred's translations and prefaces the origin of both learning and parliamentary tradition. Renaissance scholars hailed him as philosopher king. He was called England's Solomon, a ruler whose reign could be compared to the ages of gold of biblical and classical law. Ballads and histories depicted him as the very art and heart of England, humble, curious, lovable, stern when needed, but always fair. The printing press multiplied his laws and chronicles. The Psalms, translated as Alfred commanded, shaped the rhythm and poetry of English devotion. In all, Alfred's thought and example reached further than he could have ever imagined. Alfred in modern memory. No English schoolchild grew up after the 18th century without learning of Alfred burning the cakes or reading how he founded England. Statues of Alfred appeared in Winchester, Wantage, London and beyond, sometimes austere, sometimes heroic, always a monument to the endurance of a nation. The poet Tennyson and later novelists and historians drew on Alfred's legend to address modern doubts and hopes. In wars of independence and reform, English thinkers evoked the great king's example to urge justice and wisdom upon their contemporaries. Queen Victoria herself claimed Alfred as the ancestor of her house, and his example as a model of duty and moral rectitude. Statesmen, soldiers, and social reformers looked to his reign as proof that leadership and compassion could coexist. Even as 20th century troubles, world wars, depressions, and upheavals tested the people of England, Alfred's story reminded many that endurance, resilience, and a commitment to learning could carry a nation through any storm. The light that lasts. The legacy of Alfred the Great cannot be neatly contained in law or story, in building or battle. It exists in the fabric of English-speaking civilization, the expectation of justice and fair law, the fostered curiosity of learners, the humility and courage of true leaders. His dream of a united and wise nation, sheltering the lowly and the stranger, learned in faith and justice, still speaks through the centuries. In every challenge met, in every law justly interpreted, in every school or church that opens its doors to the humble and curious, the echo of Alfred's feet can be heard, his voice still gentle, still strong, calling to the future. The king who kindled hope in the face of ruin, who saw a nation not yet born, remains by every measure truly great. Alfred the Great, Part 8, The Living Legacy. A day in the life of Alfred. Imagine now, a spring morning at Winchester, toward the end of Alfred's reign. The minster bells sound before sunrise, echoing through the misty streets and fields beyond the city's ramparts. Alfred, long since used to waking before any man in his household, rises quietly, his body stiff with old pain. Before breaking fast, the king prays in his private chapel, attended by a trusted priest, perhaps Plegmund or Grimbold. He prays for his children, his people, and for wisdom. Give light to our darkness, O Lord. Raise up England from ashes to peace. Breakfast is simple. Bread, a cup of milk or weak ale, maybe a rare fresh apple or cheese, and, on good days, honey. The royal steward brings news, reports from Bourges, a merchant from Francia, a messenger from the Welsh border. The house buzzes with quiet activity. A noble's children learning their letters from a priest, servants laying rushes on the floor, the queen and her attendants preparing to receive guests. Mid-morning brings the royal council, held in the long timbered hall. Officials and thanes crowd the benches. Pearls of wax from scented candles dot the table. Alfred listens to disputes with a thoughtful patience. Two men quarrel over a boundary stone. A widow seeks judgment against a dishonest reeve. An abbot brings a request for land renewal after a fire. The king's approach is always the same. Listen carefully, question gently, weigh the words of both high and low. Let justice, not advantage, be done, he instructs his stewards. When disputes cannot be resolved by agreement, he offers solutions, compensation instead of vengeance, exile only when trust cannot be mended. Between sessions, Alfred reviews the scholar's latest work. A boy recites a passage in Latin. Another struggles to read a Saxon psalm. The king offers encouragement and even gently corrects grammar. He thanks Ealhswith for her kindness to the poor and orphans, and asks what news the nuns at Shaftesbury have sent. Lunch is modest and often shared with clerics or warriors, where the talk is of land, law, or sometimes poetry. Sometimes Alfred himself asks a riddle or tells a story from his travels to Rome, remembering the marvels of the ancient city or the relics received from the Pope. Afternoons bring royal business, correspondence, treaties, plans for new burghs. Alfred dictates letters to far-off abbots, to continental rulers, to his children. He wonders aloud about the changing balance of power. Franks to the south, Danes to the east, the Welsh and Scots in unpredictable moods. When sickness overcomes him, Alfred retires out of sight. But even in pain he reads and meditates, his days ordered by candle clocks, an invention he devised, each marked by careful measurement, so that prayer and study could be evenly divided, even in winter's darkness. As dusk falls, he walks the palace grounds or sits near the hearth, surrounded by grandchildren and the children of favoured thanes. He listens to songs, sometimes an old lay of Beowulf, sometimes a children's chant. He teaches them not only kingly virtues, but the pleasures of music and verse. Before sleep, Alfred visits the chapel once more. He confides in his Lord as always, more in humility than pride. He asks forgiveness for his faults and patience for those hardships yet to come. Stories around the hearth, on stormy nights, when the wind sweeps in from the Solent and the city gathers to the safety of fire and candle. Tales of Alfred and his people are told and retold. There is the tale of Alfred disguised as a minstrel, entering Guthrum's hall during the dark months of exile. With harp in hand and cloak drawn close, he moves unnoticed among his enemies, memorizing their plans. The king who knew his people's tongue could blend in among the meanest or the proudest, minstrels say, and so find wisdom where swords could not reach. Another favorite tells of the burnt cakes. After a winter spent in hiding, cold and hungry on the marshes of Athelney, Alfred finds shelter with a peasant woman. She asks him, ignorant of his station to mind, her cakes in the embers, while she tends the herd. Distracted by grave matters of war and his prayers, the king lets the cakes burn. The woman, angry, berates him. "You are so quick to eat them, but slow to turn them." The king accepts her rebuke with grace. Thus, say the elders, Alfred learned to mind the smallest labours as well as the highest. This story, more than victory or law, made Alfred beloved by all who labour. There are darker stories too, of desperate battles at Ashdown and Eddington, of burghs besieged, of mothers and sons lost to the sword. But in each telling, hope returns, and the heroes are not always noblemen, but carles, priests' sons, and the wise women of the land. An inviting court. Alfred's Winchester was not a close place. Pilgrims from the north and merchants from Brittany came with news, goods, and sometimes alarming tales. Travelling Welsh bards found a warm welcome, and storytellers from beyond the sea were honoured if they could teach a new riddle or ballad. When a party of scholars from Ireland arrived, bearing rare books and looking for sanctuary, they were welcomed. One, a scribe named Duban, wrote in his old Celtic tongue of Alfred's learning and hospitality. Here was a king who loved parchment more than gold, Duban recorded, and more than victory, loved peace and found it only in God. Victims of Viking raids, Saxons, Britons, and even surrendered Danes were offered land and a place if they pledged peace. The mingling of accents in the markets proved Alfred's strategy, as did the coins stamped with his name used by both Saxon and Danelaw merchants. As Italian travellers and Frankish monks passed through, they carried word of Alfred's court back across Christendom. They praised his love of learning, the resourceful queen and her tireless nuns, the model children, and the strange sight of a king correcting the grammar of a bishop or listening humbly to a rural priest's worries. The labour of law. The work of Alfred's justices did not end with royal pronouncements. Each fortnight, reeves and sheriffs carried out judgments across Wessex. Sometimes the king travelled, holding moots in the fields, under canvas, or beneath the boughs of great oaks, where dozens or hundreds gathered to hear law dispensed. One day, a then stands accused of beating a cotter, a small tenant farmer, beyond reason. The local reeve hesitates, fearing the noble's anger. Word reaches Alfred, who arrives by surprise. The king hears the case, consults his advisors, and then rules for the cotter. The thegn is ordered to pay compensation, but not banished. Alfred counsels both, ending the matter with public prayers. Those present remember the king's fairness, saying, "He would not see a poor man wronged, nor a great man shamed without cause." Letters and proclamations go out, reminding all that every man, high or low, has a right to justice in Christ's name and in the king's. Tales of courage. Ethelflaed and Edward. While Alfred presides over his court, his children earn their own renown. Letters from Mercia speak of Ethelflaed's walls rising higher each year, burghs defending Stafford, Bridgenorth, and Chester. Her armies drive back raiders, and her wise words reconcile Welsh princes to English rule. Fishermen along the Severn tell how she travelled through storms to rescue captives and restore a ruined abbey. Edward, meanwhile, rides with his father's captains, driving back new Viking encampments. He oversees the repair of London's ancient walls, begun by Alfred, and presses on journeys to the Danelaw, bringing warning and promise. Swear peace, keep the law, and you shall have trade and shelter. Betray it, and my armies will not rest. Their deeds become part of Alfred's living legacy, proof that wisdom and courage are not the domain of a single king, but the lifeblood of a family and a nation. The quiet of night. King's reflections. During sleepless nights, worn out by illness, anxieties, and visions of coming strife, Alfred sometimes walks in the shadowed cloisters alone, or sits by the embers. He reflects on the journey from Wantage to Winchester, from the dreams of his mother's poems to the burning of cities and holy places. He remembers Rome, the Pope's blessing, the lost brothers who did not live to see the dawn. He wonders what will come of all he has built. Will his laws survive the ambitions of lesser men? Will the burghs shield his grandchildren as they did the kingdom in his time? Will the books he sweated to see copied in English one day spread to every corner of the land? Or will war and time scatter them to dust? Yet he finds consolation in faith and in the rhythms of daily piety, a kingdom braced between duty and hope, forever imperfect, forever in need of wise hands. He thinks, finally, of his people, those who tilled the soil, who manned the walls, who made his visions real, not by might, but by endurance and patience and trust. It is for them, he knows, that kings exist. The people are the life of a king, as the roots are to a tree. Forget the one, and the other will surely fall. He smiles, and for a moment forgets his pain. At dawn, he will rise to begin again. Alfred the Great, Part 9, Twilight and the Tide of Memory. The waning light. As the seasons turned and Alfred reached the later years of his life, Winchester and her king acquired a kind of serenity, a sense that, though storms might gather, England possessed deeper roots than its foes ever guessed. Nowhere was this more visible than at festival times. Alfred's Winchester, rebuilt and bustling, was alive with colour. On great church feasts, nobles and commoners mingled. Market stalls offered foreign spices, cheeses, and crafted goods. And minstrels sang not just of saints, but of Alfred and his family. Children learned letters and verses. Priests recited Alfred's own translations of holy texts, their Old English clear as morning bells. Yet between festivals, the work of peace never ceased. Raiders still prowled the coast at times. A failed harvest might drive poor men toward desperation. Alfred and his stewards guarded not only towns, but the countryside as well, sending roving wardens to ride the Herepath roads, keeping peace and succour where old wounds lingered. Despite renewed threats from the Danelaw or unrest among the restless nobility, the king's last decade was marked by, if not security, at least a feeling that England, no longer just Wessex, might outlive the squabbles and invasions that had threatened his soul for generations. Voices of the land. At the heart of Alfred's reign were the countless voices rarely recorded in the chronicles, but whose lives bore the stamp of his decisions. A burr builder's tale. A weathered craftsman in Winchester remembers carrying timbers, stones, and lime for the king's walls. Illiterate, he can nevertheless recite the roll call of Alfred's workers: Somerset men, Mercian men, even Danes who swore oaths. That wall is their sweat together. He names Alfred the father of the living. For where he once eked out a perilous life in the fields, his son now runs a thriving booth, trading wool and bowls. The poor widow's plea. A widow, robbed by outlaws and nearly ruined, brought her plea to the royal court. She feared the sharp words of Reeves, but Alfred himself listened, asked gentle questions, and ruled in her favour. She later tells her grandchildren that the king listened as if to a bishop, though I wore only rags, and that, from that day, she prayed each morning for Alfred and all the good judges of the English. A young scholar's dream. A boy from humble origins, sent to the Minster School, marvels at the endless lines of Latin and English text, wonders at the beauty of the old songs. He copies Alfred's preface to Boethius, and by candlelight dreams that learning might free a man born poor, if only he work as hard as any soldier. A Danish convert. One Harold, once a sea raider, stands among his new kin at a burgh's gates. He tells his fellows, "In Alfred's peace, a man keeps what he earns, no warlord takes it by right. Here, if you kneel in church and learn the law, you are called neighbour." Each of these is a small, unheralded victory, a thread in the cloth the king has woven. Alfred's foreign correspondence. From his palace, Alfred looked outward as well as within. He exchanged letters with Pope John VIII and later Formosus. He sent gifts, perhaps golden chalices or manuscripts, to the Roman See, requesting prayers for England's safety and guidance in troubled times. Envoys from Francia brought news of kings and rebellions. Alfred reciprocated with messages of alliance and faith, offering advice on reforms and urging Christian brotherhood against further Norse incursions. On one occasion, Persian silk makes its way to Winchester, a testament to trade routes stretching east past Venice and Byzantium, all the way to Baghdad and beyond. A Greek-born priest visiting England is astounded by the mixture of Saxon and Danish folk at worship together, by the openness of Alfred's court, and by the quiet authority of the old king who dispenses bread from his own table and wisdom from his own mind. The aftershocks of reform. By the late 890s, Alfred's England was strikingly different from the battered realm he inherited in 871. The burghs and their laws governed nearly every aspect of life: tolls and weights, market times, penalties for theft, and rules for inheritance. New communities of monks and nuns dotted the land, reviving arts, copying books, and providing care for the old and sick. Where there once were only a handful of scholars in all Wessex, now dozens debated grammar and scripture, and even women's convents produced skilled scribes. The roads, once terrorized by raiders, could be traveled by merchants and messengers, if not always in perfect safety, at least under the law's watch. Even the language changed. The English tongue grew richer as it absorbed Danish and Latin terms, producing new ways to express faith, law, and love. The last battles. In 893, the king heard word of a vast Viking host arriving in the Thames, with more ships and men than any seen since the early years of his kingship. The Danes, allied with Welsh and disaffected Mercians, overran burhs and dashed deep into English hinterlands. Alfred, sick but undaunted, rose from his bed and rode to muster the Fyrd. He dispatched Edward and Ethelfled to defend burhs, took personal command whenever possible, and orchestrated a series of desperate maneuvers that checked and eventually repelled the invaders. These battles were not grand victories like Edington, but exhausting struggles of siege, starvation, and relentless pursuit. Nonetheless, each time the kingdom held. Afterwards, Alfred confided to Asa, "I am weary, but with each labor the tree grows stronger, its roots deeper." The kingdom that might have fractured instead emerged, if battered, more unified than ever. The coming of age of Edward and Ethelfled. As the king aged, more and more did he look to his children. Edward, now mature and proven, not only wielded the sword, but gathered admirers for his leniency and love of learning. Ethelfled, his sister, was by then famous as both a builder and a banisher of raiders. Their rivalry as children had become an abiding partnership, especially as they planned for the day the house of Alfred would extend over Mercia and all the Danelaw. Alfred taught them, "Strength keeps a kingdom, but wisdom makes it worthy. Always remember the poorest, for with them God walks the land." He reminded them that burrs could fall and even the best law be twisted unless those entrusted with power loved the peace more than their own gain. Alfred's final gifts and farewell. It is said that in his last months, Alfred worked on dividing his possessions, a testament of lands, silver, relics, and, above all, the charge to keep England as one people. The will, crafted in clear but humble prose, left most to Edward and Ethelfled, but remembered every relative, godchild, servant, and faithful priest or craftsman. At his passing, there were no grand boasts nor banners unfurled. Alfred asked only for prayers and for the peace he had so long pursued for others. He blessed his children, reminding them never to scorn the exile or the stranger, a lesson learned amid the swamps and wild places he had once called home. As the bells tolled and the priests chanted their Latin, the city fell silent. For 3 days, peasants and lords, priests and warriors, Danish settlers and wandering scholars made pilgrimage to the old minster, each leaving a token, a sheaf of grain, a coin, a scrap of parchment, a flower, or a whispered prayer. Twilight into legend Alfred's burial was both an end and a beginning. Already, travellers and chroniclers spoke of miracles at his grave, the healing of a sick child, crops flourishing around Winchester, peace in lands once famed for blood feud. His children, shaped by his wisdom and sorrows, would prove worthy inheritors. Edward would become Edward the Elder, pressing Alfred's reforms into the Midlands and the North. Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, ruled nobly and left the land better than she found it. And so, as Wessex and England moved forward, the memory of Alfred became not just a personal legacy, but the beating heart of a people's hope, forever looking back to the great king who had loved, endured, and rebuilt a nation from the ashes, ready for the final part, where the Alfredian legend reaches into future centuries, and his legacy is weighed, retold, and renewed from medieval times into our modern age. Here is Part 10, about 2,000 words, drawing together Alfred's legacy through the centuries, how his memory was preserved, invoked, interpreted, and even contested from the Middle Ages into modern times. This part brings your historical chronicle to a fitting close with the future of the Alfredian myth and nation. Alfred the Great, Part 10, Everlasting King. From chronicle to legend, as the 10th century passed into the 11th, the memory of Alfred was never far from English hearts. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, started in his court, became both an archive and a prayer record in simple English that, in time, would outlast temples and towers. When new kings took the throne, they stood before Alfred's tomb to show respect. In times of peril, when the Danish king Cnut claimed the crown, or Normans swept through the land, his name was whispered in oaths and invoked as a shield against forgetfulness and despair. Monks in abbeys across England preserve stories of the prudent king who never spared himself for the sake of his people. Even as Norman conquerors razed and rebuilt Winchester, They kept alive tales of Alfred's wisdom, sometimes as caution, sometimes as desperate hope for an age of justice. Supplicants still came to his grave. Over generations, the line between fact and sacred legend blurred. New miracles and visions were reported, a healing at the tomb, a vision of the Virgin Mary beside the old king, or, in moments of crisis, the king appearing in a dream to warn or console. The law's foundation and political myth. In the courts of later England, Alfred's dooms were copied and cited as the precedent for all good English law. Magna Carta, crafted in crisis in 1215, claimed descent from Alfred's principles, a king beneath the law, protecting the weak as well as wielding the sword. As Parliament emerged, rebellious barons and wise judges alike invoked Alfred as the first king who ruled by counsel, not by decree alone. Monarchs from the Plantagenets to the Tudors paid lip service to the old customs of Alfred's time. Even Henry VIII, in breaking the Church of Rome, wrapped himself in the mantle of Alfred's English Christianity. In hard and hungry centuries, peasant rebels like those of the 1381 revolt named Alfred their champion against greedy lords. The balance he had struck, justice before power, learning alongside, might became a mirror in which later England measured both progress and sin. Poet and pilgrim Alfred in medieval and early modern England. Writers and minstrels clung to the king's story. In Layam's Brut, one of the first great English narratives, Alfred's memory shines like a lamp in darkness. Geoffrey of Monmouth, though sometimes fanciful, preserves hints of the grandeur with which later generations remembered him. Chaucer's pilgrims in the Canterbury Tales walk roads that Alfred built and speak a tongue the king had cherished. In their world, justice and jests, learning and struggle, burr and field mingle the old king's dreams, half remembered, living on. In the Renaissance, as England's world widened, the king's legend was renewed. Playwrights invoked good King Alfred as the measure of kingship. Printers published his laws alongside chronicles of Arthur and Charlemagne. Travelers from Europe marveled that so much hope and memory was bound up in the figure of one long-dead Saxon. The statue and the schoolbook. It was in the 18th and 19th centuries, the ages of empire, revolution and reform, that Alfred's image was recast anew. In the face of threats from France or unrest at home, reformers and conservatives alike claimed Alfred as their model. Statues of Alfred rose in London, Wantage, and most famously, Winchester. Each showed the king as a warrior, a lawgiver, a thinker. Some even placed a sword in one hand and a book in the other, an intentional reminder of his rare unity of strength and intellect. Victorian writers, eager for national heroes, celebrated the king's restoration of the people, his schools for all classes, his mercy to the conquered. Tennyson and Dickens echoed his virtues, and his legend was made staple reading for every English child. It was said that, were Alfred to return, he would recognize the laws of the land and the learning in the schools as the flowering of seeds he had himself sown. The bronze Alfred at Winchester, erected in 1899, a millennium after his death, towers above the city streets, a silent sentinel over the people he once led. Alfred and the modern imagination. Even in a world of skyscrapers and cyberspace, Alfred's story retains power. Britain's constitutional monarchy, parliamentary democracy, and devotion to justice and scholarship are, in stories told and retold, said to owe more to King Alfred than any single figure. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, historians rediscovered his real struggles, his illnesses, doubts, and the stubbornness with which he pursued justice. The philosopher king became more three-dimensional, at once a product of his age and a beacon to all who would reform a broken land. Literature, art, and film revisit the old tales, sometimes retelling them with new doubts and new hope. The long shadow of Alfred falls across debates about Englishness, about the relationship of ruler and ruled, about the value still of learning and humility. When Britain faced moments of supreme danger, from the Blitz in World War II to the uncertainties of the new millennium, some remembered the king who endured ruin and rose again, not by conquest alone, but by reform, patience, and faith. The Alfredian Tapestry. What endures? What then is Alfred's gift to us? Beyond law, literacy, victory, or even legend, it is perseverance and vision. He showed that a kingdom broken by violence could be knit anew through mercy as well as sword. He proved, through his daily example, that justice demands both humility and strength, that peace is won by listening as well as leading, that a true king or any leader entertains not only warriors, but teachers, scribes, and the poor at his table. His reign, brief by the measure of centuries, remade the soil in which Englishness now grows. He endured personal tragedy, exile, and illness without bitterness. He built systems that survived him. He reminded England and the world that the worth of a king lies in what he brings out in his people, their courage, their kindness, their thirst for learning, their unity. The song without end. The bells of Winchester ring still, and each year pilgrims and wanderers pass the statue and the gardens where his children once ran. The old minster is long gone, but within every school, court, or church where English is spoken, the work of Alfred continues. Somewhere, a child reads their first words in the language Alfred saved. A judge dispenses mercy in a way the king would have honored. A leader, faced with crisis, chooses not only war, but wisdom, and, perhaps remembering the old stories, finds the courage to begin again. As the sun sets across the green hills of Wessex, as the rivers wind toward the sea, the land recalls the king who was, in every sense, great not for perfect victories, but for building the hope that outlasts ruin, the peace that endures the storm. Wherever justice is cherished, learning nourished, and the weary sheltered, the spirit of Alfred the Great walks beside us, even to the world's last day. The last word in the story of Alfred the Great does not belong to any chronicler, nor can it be found inscribed on stone or in weathered book. Instead, it shines out quietly in the continued life of a people and a country, resilient, thoughtful, and ever reaching toward a better dawn. Alfred's kingdom, shaped under siege and sorrow, was not an empire of glittering palaces or endless conquest. It was, in truth, a tapestry of villages and towns, strongholds and churches, where the battered hearts of survivors learned, slowly, to beat together in hope rather than in fear. It is in the ordinary victories, peaceful harvests, where once only graves had been found, the laughter of children learning their letters in a humble school, a widow receiving justice from her king, a pagan, once an enemy, praying at dawn among former foes, that Alfred's legacy is written most truly. His greatness came not from unchecked power, but from his willingness to listen, to adapt, to dream, and to forgive. He was not without failings, nor were all his labors crowned with success. The wars returned in new shapes, Norsemen still came, fields still burned, and sometimes, in the centuries after, England would forget the lessons Alfred struggled so hard to teach. But time and again, in darkness and division, his example proved a lamp not brilliant enough to end all shadow, but bright enough to show another step on the path. After Alfred, his family completed the forging of England. His laws formed the foundation of justice, his schools, the foundation of knowledge, and his vision of unity outlived both his body and his bloodline. In the centuries that followed, in courts, in parliaments, in reform movements, and peaceful resistance, the wisdom of Alfred was invoked as both shield and challenge. His story became not merely history, but a deep well of ideas and ideals. To each new generation, he offered questions as well as answers. Can a nation scarred by violence be rebuilt by justice, mercy, and learning? What is the true strength of a ruler, dominion over men, or the patience to build for those yet unborn? How does one preserve faith and identity without hatred, even in the face of the unknown or the foreign? Must greatness always be measured by conquest, or is it, more truly, the ability to foster peace out of chaos and renewal out of ruin? Today, Alfred's England stands transformed, a world of electric light and distant horizons, where the battles are different, but the search for wisdom and justice endures. Yet the roots he planted remain. English is still the language of thought and prayer. The law remembers its ancient debts. The stories, sung or silent, bind community to community. If on some future day, all that he built should once again be threatened by the storms of time, by war, by forgetfulness, those who look to Alfred's memory will recall a simple truth. One humble, resolute life can change the fate, not just of a kingdom, but of an entire people. From the marshes of Somerset to the halls of Parliament, from the scriptorium to the child's first book, from the justice sought by the lowliest to the burden borne by kings, the spirit of Alfred the Great endures a lamp in the night, waiting always to be kindled anew.